I want to thank everybody for joining. I see more folks signing in. And as you do, I want to just thank you all for taking the time to join us here at the Climate Center for the third webinar in our Climate Safe California webinar series. I'm going to talk about Climate Safe California in a moment. I'm going to thank our many sponsors. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the agenda, and then I'm going to introduce our first speaker in just a couple of minutes. So Climate Safe California is a comprehensive policy platform, and we are covering that in a series of webinars that go on through the spring and into the summer. This is the third one on community energy resilience, but I do want to point out that there are 4 more webinars in this series still to come. Clean mobility, natural sequestration, funding climate action, how are we going to pay for all this, and Climate Safe California Policy Summit that we'll be holding in the early summer, and we hope you'll all be able to join us for all of those. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to our next webinar on clean mobility, driving to 2030 with speed and equity. If you're not yet registered, I'm going to ask my colleague Nina, who you'll be meeting a little bit later today, to drop a link to this webinar registration into the chat. That's going to be on April 28th. Assemblymember Phil Ting, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, Coalition for Clean Air, and others will be there. We hope you can join us also. I'd like to take a moment now to thank the sponsors, because this happens, all of this happens. Climate Safe California only happens when we work together. So I want to thank all the businesses and agencies that have supported this program: Renewable America, Enphase, Jackson Family Wines, one of our local stalwart sustainability companies. Thank you, Jackson. Thank you, Renewable America and Enphase. You'll be hearing from them a little bit later in the program. I also want to thank MCE, Willow Creek Wealth Management, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, Peninsula Clean Energy, Silicon Valley Clean Energy, River City Bank, Sunrun, and Terra Verde. What all of these sponsors tell me is that this program is important to the private sector. It's important to the people who make the jobs and make the things that are going to help us create a clean energy economy of the future. Thanks also to our promotional partners, the community that makes this possible. You can see here some of the groups: Better World Group, GRID, Local Government Commission, Acterra, Joint Venture, Climate Resolve, California League of Conservation Voters, Clean Coalition, Drawdown Bay Area, Community Environmental Council, and the Center for Sustainable Energy. What all of these organizations tell me is the community also believes in our work and is here to support our work, and we thank you and all of you for being part of that. I would like to now just take a brief moment to share a snappy little video with you from one of our sponsors. They were not able to join us here today. MCE Clean Energy would like to share this with you, and so enjoy.
This land was built by makers. We came with a fire in our bellies, toiled to build a place to call home. We led movements, sparked innovation. Our strength comes from real people, not corporate giants. From the food we eat, to the air we breathe, to the clean energy that powers our lives. We're makers, but also change makers. Thank you for making a positive change.
I really just want to say one thing. What MCE was talking about is what we all believe in. We work together to make this happen. So let me just talk briefly about Climate Safe California. It's a program put together by the Climate Center. Our mission is speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions. We're happy that you could be here today to talk about community energy resilience, a key pillar of that. Why? Because the climate apocalypse is now. I don't have to remind all of you of the orange skies that we had just a few months ago. This is not something for the future. We are experiencing the climate crisis today. So Climate Safe California is a multi-pronged policy platform that can help us get to net negative emissions by 2030, 15 years ahead of California's current goals. We have 3 principles. Everything that we propose needs to be aligned with the latest science. We need to secure a just transition for fossil fuel workers, and we need to promote climate justice through inclusion and equity. What does that mean? It means we need to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels, scale up nature-based sequestration, invest in community resilience, which is what we're here to talk about today, and fund climate action in a massive way. We believe this is possible, and that's why we're here. Community resilience, and specifically what we're here to talk about today, some of the things we believe in is to fund implementation of resilience plans in all California counties and cities, implement clean energy community microgrids with storage, and that includes electric vehicles, and establish environmental justice resilience hubs. I'm going to leave it to our speakers to talk about how all that's going to happen, because that's exactly what some of them are going to talk about. We have two bills currently working their way through the legislature that we helped support and sponsor. SB 99 by Senator Dodd and AB 1325 by Assemblymember Burke. 99 is a planning bill. Burke's bill is a build and fund it bill. And we'll talk more about those towards the end of our program here today. I'd like to invite you all to join over 1,000 individuals, elected companies, and NGOs who've endorsed Climate Safe California. Nina's going to drop a link in the chat. If you have not yet endorsed Climate Safe California, we would love you to do so. It's a very simple process. Please add your name to this list. I'm hoping that through the course of the webinar today, we can add 50 more names to this list, and you can be among them. So thank you all for everything and your patience. I'm now going to move on to our first speaker. Let's get on with it. Lorenzo Christoph has worked in electricity policy for over 25 years at the state and national levels in the US and overseas. He's currently an independent policy expert. And from 1999 to 2017, Lorenzo, I believe you worked at the California Independent System Operator, CAISO. And knowing a little bit about you, I will say, you know of what you speak. So please share your vision for a future California energy system.
Okay, thanks, Doron. I'm going to share screen now. Hopefully this will all work well. And then I move into slideshow mode. Okay, so hopefully everybody's seeing this in slideshow mode. I'm going to set context here. Really, it's the speakers who follow me that are going to get into a lot more details, but I want to draw a little big picture context for where we are, both as the industry and in terms of where we're trying to go with community energy resilience. First of all, I'd start with the societal context we're in. Doron referred to this with his opening comments, but basically we need urgent action. The disruptions to the climate are happening now. They're getting worse. Impacts fall most heavily on vulnerable, disadvantaged communities and vulnerable people. And energy systems are both a cause of the disruptions we're experiencing, and yet we have to have energy. So that means we got to transform it somehow. And I describe that in terms of three major goals that we work towards in parallel. Sustainability, resilience, I like to distinguish between what those are. Sustainability is stop making things worse. And that'll be a relatively slower process, converting everything we do that uses energy into sustainable practices. Largely is about decarbonization, electrification, reducing and displacing fossil fuels. Whereas resilience is more immediate, to be prepared for the impacts of the damage that we've already done. Even if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, we've set disruptive cycles in motion that will play out over the coming decades, and we need to have greater resilience to do that. And then equity is talked about a lot today. We really need to make it very concrete and practical for people on the ground. So prioritizing environmental and social justice and creating a just transition for folks who are displaced in the fossil fuel industries to not be harmed. So all of these goals require local action. And I think that's the insight that we're not seeing enough of yet among the policymakers. There's still too much top-down thinking, but it's really local action that's going to make the difference. Decarbonization, a lot of the things that will affect reduction in carbon emissions come from local planning, urban planning, county planning. It's things like housing density. Where do people live relative to where they work? Assuming many people will be going back to work as COVID phases out. Zoning and land use decisions, building codes, creating local mobility services that are clean to reduce reliance on private vehicles and fossil fuels. So all of these things will contribute to decarbonization and need to be harmonized with how we plan the energy systems. Resilience, similarly, is always local. The impacts are on the ground. They affect people's lives, often in tremendously dramatic manners. And we have to build resilience through local energy systems and microgrids. And then finally, equity is also local because it's people and communities where the impacts play out, and that's where we want to be sure that resilience, health benefits, economic benefits reach all people, all communities, and all neighborhoods. So with those three goals, then, here's a little snapshot of the bigger picture in the industry. And it's very fortunate that as we think about localizing energy, the technology is on our side. There are so many fantastic things happening that enable a more community-based energy system. So I describe it as the power system evolving to more of a from what it's always been, which is a kilowatt hour delivery system, to an interactive network. And the big thing that I think, another realization that I think has not yet sunk in, is that we don't have to get electricity from the grid anymore. There are options. And for 100 years, it's been true that if you want electricity, you get it from the grid. Well, now the scalable technologies are in direct competition, and there's a new behind the meter market. There's the possibility of creating alternatives. And this becomes important because from the perspective of customers and communities, we can be grid participants. We can create local resources that not only meet local needs, but that also align with state policy goals around decarbonization, and that also align with the needs of the grid. We can create local systems that support grid operation that don't need to disconnect, but can be part of an interactive network. And the warning, I think, for policymakers is that if we ignore creating a policy framework that really benefits all of the communities and customers, many of them, and especially the more affluent ones, are liable to leave the grid anyway. And that would be a societally inferior outcome. One way that I illustrate this is saying that the electricity is evolving to be bimodal with a vibrant participatory distribution side. Again, for 100 years, all the generating plants are on what we call the bulk system. They're big central station plants, usually more remote from load, although there are some exceptions, and relying on high voltage transmission. Customers largely passive, distribution one way. And where we're moving to is where the whole distribution side now becomes a major hub of activity that produces energy locally, stores it locally, manages electricity demand locally. And through advancing these local projects, not only do we bring local benefits, but we can also avoid grid infrastructure, costly infrastructure upgrades. So what is the strategy here? What we'd like to see is a statewide program, and of course, if there's infrastructure funding coming out of the federal government, a national program to deploy clean, resilient, distributed resources, microgrids, energy efficiency, retrofits, demand management, all over the country and every community. This kind of a broad, comprehensive program will have huge diverse benefits. It will increase resilience, more rapid decarbonization, create well-paying jobs, bring community financial benefits if we can create models of local ownership, attract private investment so it's not ratepayers who are taking all the risks, and then minimize grid impacts. So we see this as a hugely beneficial opportunity. Last slide, I'll get into just a little bit about the policies and the bills in the legislature that we're working on. So I think of it as a top-down meets bottom-up energy transition. Number one, the upper left-hand corner is SB 99, which Duran mentioned. That's really the one about planning. Number two, the Energy Resilience Equity Act, AB 1325. That's about funding and building stuff. And then number three, for which we don't have a bill at this point, but reforming the distribution utility. I haven't mentioned much about that, but it's a really important piece. We need the utilities, the distribution to utilities to be enablers, to be collaborators, to be facilitators of this local bottom-up revolution where we're designing and building resources locally. So number one, the SB 99 would actually create a local government planning process through funding and through expertise from the Energy Commission, and the local government planning processes would then come up with shovel-ready local projects that can be built. It doesn't build them yet, but it plans them and identifies them. And then number two, the Energy Resilience Equity Act actually provides the funding to build those local projects. Again, as I mentioned, the distribution utility becomes the enabler. In the very bottom row, this reflects the participation that we're looking for that would actually be part of the planning process. Customers themselves, neighborhoods, businesses, community-based organizations, they define really what are the local needs and priorities. Local agencies and city utilities become participants so that what's being built is part of the larger city vision of itself through urban planning or county planning, as I mentioned. The CCAs play an important role in this, and of course the microgrid and technology providers are part of this, and with the utility as an open access provider then becomes also a participant. And where we get to, the yellow box on the right, clean, resilient, distributed future power system. And that's the end. I'll pass it back to Goran.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lorenzo. That was really interesting. There's so much to cover here, and I just want to acknowledge to everybody that that we know we're covering a lot of information here. So please drop your questions in the Q&A. We will have a time for some questions with Lorenzo and our first few panelists before we move to our industry panel, and then we'll have some more Q&A at that point. So if you have questions, please do drop those in the Q&A, and we will get to as many of them as we can. I want to thank you all again. I see Barry. Do you trying to say something, Barry? If not, I will introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Katrina Lenny-Koenig, who works at the California Energy Commission as part of the Energy and Research and Development Division. Katrina leads a team to develop technology scale-up and outreach initiatives to accelerate a just transition. So I'd like to welcome Katrina and the California Energy Commission to today's webinar. Katrina, go ahead.
Hello, thank you everyone. Lorenzo, that was fantastic. So thanks for setting up the stage for our talk today. So as they mentioned, my name is Katrina Lenny-Koenig, and I'm coming from the California Energy Commission's Research and Development Division. I'll be introducing our advanced energy community projects as a model for developing energy resilience. I'm also joined here today by my colleague Mike Gravely, who has been leading microgrid technology development at the CEC for many years. So a lot of the technologies that we have here today are a result of his work. So happy to have him here with us. So just drawing an analogy from nature. So nature is really our best designer. We can understand what constitutes a resilient, self-sustaining ecosystem and know what it should look like. So in my view, we can apply this to energy resilience for communities in that the technologies and solutions must be diverse, interconnected, and balanced, meaning that access is equitable. Also, the ecosystem is place dependent. So you heard that from Lorenzo. You cannot remove the importance of place in how it evolves. So this emphasizes the importance of considering the local community in determining the best approach to the development of meaningful and impactful resilience solutions. So as we go in to invest billions, if not trillions of dollars into clean energy, we cannot ignore the diversity of our challenges. So we must leverage this opportunity to identify integrated solutions from a systems approach that can more effectively advance our goals. We will not be able to fully address our challenges through homogeneous and siloed solutions. So now on to the CEC's R&D program. The CEC EPIC program currently invests $133 million annually to support research and development of clean energy technologies. 65% of our technology demonstration and deployment funds have gone towards projects located in and benefiting disadvantaged and low-income communities. And we've also invested $21 million towards projects with California Native American tribes. So the importance of these R&D investments can really be understood based on past, present, present and future contexts. So first, these investments begin to address historical environmental injustices and underinvestment in our communities. So you can see the disproportionate pollution burden as evident in the CalEnviroscreen tool on the right. So through our current demonstration projects, we're working to overcome some of the barriers to clean energy adoption in these communities and making the technologies more accessible. The real benefits from R&D will be realized in the long run. If we do this right, we can support an inclusive transition towards a clean energy future, reducing energy burden for low-income residents, creating jobs that provide a thriving wage, supporting capacity building for communities, and of course, enhancing community resilience, which is what we're here to talk about today. So an example of a recently completed EPIC project that has successfully demonstrated the benefits of investing in community resilience is the Blue Lake Rancheria microgrid. So when they experienced a planned outage in 2019, I hear someone's mic just to mute. Okay, so when they experienced a planned outage in 2019, 10,000 Californians still had power and 4 lives were saved because of medical equipment that was available due to the power being online. Also in 2017, fire crews were able to keep their central command online during a wildfire for 78 minutes because of the microgrid. So in 2016, the CEC launched its first design build competition called the EPIC Challenge, which has led to the construction of 4 advanced energy communities. These projects are taking a systems approach to advancing clean energy at a community scale. We're tackling technological innovation, developing financial mechanisms, navigating the regulatory environment, addressing community benefits, and involving key stakeholders such as local residents, businesses, community-based organizations, all the participants that Lorenzo acknowledged as key to evolving these resilient communities. All of them are involved in these projects. So we're also including the CCAs, utilities, cities, all key to supporting this level of innovation. So now I'm going to introduce the different advanced energy communities and their unique place-based solutions that will help provide a vision into the future of our electricity system. So first is the Richmond Advanced Energy Community. They're developing a distributed energy resources community that demonstrates the value of managing and optimizing an aggregation of DER technologies. So looking at solar, storage, smart devices, and enrollment includes residential homes, community municipal buildings, commercial industrial properties. They're also rehabilitating 20 blighted properties into zero net carbon homes by leveraging a social impact bond that's a partnership. It's a public-private partnership. They're hoping that this model can be transferred to other communities as well to do similar type projects. The team is also developing an AEC toolkit and guidebooks to assist other local governments with AEC development. Ami Raval, she's part of APEN. They're also a partner on this project, so I want to acknowledge that. She'll be speaking in a few minutes. So the Oakland Eco Block is taking a block-by-block approach to retrofitting homes to be energy efficient, all electric, and powered by a microgrid for resilience. So the project aims to really reduce the environmental footprint of buildings through cost-effective retrofits at the block scale. So instead of taking it one building at a time, one home at a time, it's really kind of aggregating all the resources. All right. So Bassett Avocado Heights Advanced Energy Community seeks to empower residents to be part of a local energy producing network where clean energy is affordable and accessible. Some of the unique features include a prosumer network, community resiliency hub that includes a community solar at a local church, as well as clean mobility services. The Lancaster AC is working with the local government and CCA to develop a virtual power plant and that is aggregating commercial and residential distributed energy resources. So as you can see by the figure, there will be a green district program, as well as 2 residential microgrids, school microgrids, and a community resilience center. All right. We have an open solicitation, the next EPIC Challenge. So if you're interested in advancing technologies like this, I encourage you to go to the website. Concept applications are due May 7th, but this is focused on a multifamily mixed-use building and working towards decarbonization and grid interactive technologies. And if you get one key takeaway from my presentation, it's to go visit the empowerinnovation.net online networking platform where you can connect with potential project partners and also find billions of dollars of grant funds beyond that include the CEC, but also beyond. So with that, I'll pass it to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Katrina. That was fantastic. So much good information. This is exactly the kind of thing Climate Safe California wants to promote, and we're very happy that the Energy Commission could be here today with us to share your incredible programs. Our next speaker, and you queued her up perfectly, Ami Raval from the Asian Pacific Environmental Network is our next speaker. Ami is Senior Policy Researcher at the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. And in way of introduction, I just want to mention Ami was also just recently named a GRIST's top 50 energy and climate professionals in the country. So congratulations, Ami, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the shine, and yeah, happy to be with folks today. I know I only have a short amount of time, so I'm going to go through my slides quickly, but I hope that it really grounds us in a set of values as a community-based organization representing APEN to sort of think about how we approach this work. So just to give folks a quick background, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, or APEN, we are a grassroots environmental justice organization. We've been organizing working class Asian American immigrant and refugee communities for over 25 years. And we do that through a multitude of strategies, from local organizing and leadership development with the community residents we work with, civic engagement and sort of electoral organizing among Asian American voters across California. And then the last piece is policy advocacy at the state and local levels, which is the area that I focus on. So just to contextualize, I think that it's already sort of been grounded, but in California, we see the way our state is being pushed to extremes, and the record heat, fires, and pollution clearly all have one thing in common: they were made worse by climate change. And this convergence is the strongest signal yet that the climate crisis isn't far off from the future. It's here today, more intense than ever. But while scientists are saying we've lost complete control and that there isn't a normal anymore, and that when you add these crises together, the impact is cumulative, what we know is that for environmental justice communities plagued with the burden of our polluting industries for generations, there's nothing new about cumulative health burdens. And so that's why in this moment, we're really framing that we need a just recovery, and that the time has come to make deep long-term investments in the resilience of the communities that have the least material resources. And so while the state, has pressure to cut budgets and revert to austerity, we are pushing the state to do exactly the opposite, which is make and recover through ambitious investments in communities, in public services, and high-road jobs to really repair the historic legacy of economic, public health, and environmental, racial injustice. So I wanted to offer this vision for APEN, what a resilience community looks like. And I think the image on the left is helpful to sort of notice some of the types of investments, the infrastructure you see, what the people are doing. But I actually really want to focus in on the right-hand picture, because while infrastructure investments like clean energy, microgrids, solar storage, green space, public transit, these are all important. Our vision for resilient communities is fundamentally about building power. And the image, right, says system change, not climate change. And that means really ensuring that the communities with the least material resources, the folks we organize, working class communities of color, are at the forefront of the decisions that impact their daily lives, and really are leading in the vision for what community resilience looks like in their neighborhoods. And I just want to say, in this moment, we know that through historic disinvestment and deep systemic failures, our communities have had to be incredibly resilient. So this isn't a new concept. And we see them organizing for change and innovating local models, whether that be mutual aid networks to share resources, schools providing food to families, or libraries being turned into cooling or air respite centers. Communities are showing up for each other. So that was the impetus of our Resilience Before Disaster report. And I'm not going to go into that deeply, but I invite folks to take a look at it as a resource on APEN's website. We really uplift this notion of social infrastructure as a contrast to hardening of built infrastructure, to sort of physical infrastructure such as natural resources protections, to say social infrastructure is the services and facilities that secure the economic, health, cultural, and social well-being of the community. And this list is an example of what that means. And it's some of the places I've already mentioned, like schools, libraries, park and rec sites, places of worship, youth and senior centers, childcare facilities, small businesses, or even the housing that our communities live in. One of the models we uplift in the Resilience Before Disaster are community resilience hubs, spaces that communities can gather, organize, and access social services, not only during climate shocks like fires and heat waves, and when the smoke is bad, but every day these spaces are meeting the material needs, the economic and social needs of the communities they're in. And we uplift a range of principles about how to design resilience hubs in a way that is co-created with community and uplifts a multitude of other benefits beyond clean energy. So I wanted to highlight one case study, which folks may be familiar with. The RISE Youth Center in Richmond is a project that APEN is collaborating on to become a climate resilience hub, one that has clean energy, solar and storage for backup power, but is also fundamentally about power building and youth governance and leadership in the design of RISE as the center is expanded. And this project should be complete at the end of the year. And in addition to one very local place-based model, this year we're pushing legislation to actually scale and resource resilience hubs across the state, like RISE, to make sure it's not just APEN, but community groups and activists across the state that can really envision what resilience hubs look like in their communities. I'm happy to ask questions more about that, but I won't go too deeply. And that's all that I have for folks. Thank you.
Well, Ami, thank you so much. And thank you for, most importantly, reminding us that this is not just about technology, but it's about people and it's about communities, and that we need to keep our focus on that. And so very, very important comments. I really want to thank you for everything you do and for the important voice you bring to this conversation today. We have one more speaker before we're going to go to some of the Q&A. And I would just mention that some of the questions are being answered live. So if you have questions, please do drop them in the Q&A. You can also send shout outs to our speakers through chat, but the questions should really go in the Q&A. Our next speaker is Mel Charles, and Mel is a director of regulatory and legislative policy for Silicon Valley Clean Energy. And she previously worked at the CPUC and also at Sunrun, who we'll be hearing from a little bit later. So very interesting little bundle of experiences you have, Mel. I'd like to invite you to take the stage and share your perspective from Silicon Valley.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen right now. Hopefully you all see that. So yeah, so I'm going to, hold on, there we go. I'm going to talk about investment in communities. And before I do, a little bit about SVCE. So Silicon Valley Clean Energy represents 13 member communities in Santa Clara County. So basically we cover most of Santa Clara County with the exception of San Jose, Palo Alto, and Santa Clara, the city of Santa Clara. We have very aggressive clean energy and decarbonization goals, and we do that through the power supply that we purchase. We do it through mobility and transportation electrification, and through the built environment, specifically through building electrification. And one thing we do focus on is investment in communities. Because of where we are, we focus on both investment in our local community and our member communities, but also in innovation as well. And one of the ways we've done that is through our community resiliency program, where we set aside $4.7 million for member agencies through grants. And basically, this is an opportunity to invest in energy resilience. Applications have been open and available since last year. And technical assistance is available to identify and prioritize projects. We actually have dedicated staff to work with member agencies to help them with technical assistance. And then another thing we do prioritize is the whole idea of data-driven approaches to our program offerings. And so this includes a regional analysis and tools to support all jurisdictions within our service territory. And then some example project types, they fall in two camps, through planning and through, let's just CapEx there, but investments in behind the meter technologies. So on the planning side, we have a supplemental climate resilience plan, a cost benefit analysis to inform resilience investments, and again, community engagement as well. On the CapEx side, we have programs to encourage solar and storage backup systems. And so one of those programs is Lifelong Silicon Valley, where we are partnered with Sunrun to provide backup solar and storage to support resilience needs. And I do want to note in that program, we also have a set aside for multifamily affordable housing projects. So again, speaking to that equity piece that has been discussed with throughout the speaker presentations. We also have resilient EV charging and portable batteries to support medically vulnerable customers as well. And then in terms of like our overall investments, we've invested over $5 million in energy resilience. So just looking at sort of the bigger picture beyond the sort of community member agency investments, it includes $1.15 million in planning, the $4 million in capital project grants. Then there is $350K in regional planning and $800,000 dedicated to jurisdiction planning grants as well. And that's it. I kept it at a very high level because we have limited time, but I'm happy to answer questions either now or later on and follow up with you later. And that's it. I will pass it back to the next speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Mel. Thank you for covering so much important material so concisely. We really appreciate that. I'm going to ask the folks who've already spoken. Mel, leave your camera on. Ami and Katrina and Lorenzo, if you could turn your cameras back on. We've got some time for some Q&A, and we have some good questions. Lorenzo, I'm going to start with you. There's a question from Stephen Gunther. Will energy resilience planning be integrated into existing planning processes, or is this a whole separate deal?
Well, there are existing planning processes that I think need to include resilience considerations, like cities and counties do general plans, they do climate action adaptation plans, but I think those are also rather lengthy processes. And so I think in terms of the structure of SB 99 and what we're trying to promote is something that can be a lot faster and very focused more narrowly on identifying local projects that will enhance local resilience.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much. Katrina and maybe Mike, if you guys want to address this, I have a question for you from John Rosenblum. He complimented you on your great pilot projects, but wanted to know, how will the IOUs and CCAs be required by legislation to allow microgrids for regular projects? How do we get more microgrids for regular projects? That's the question.
Yeah, I'll just start and then I'm going to pass it to Mike if he has any additional. I'll just say that these particular projects are still have to conform to existing regulatory requirements. So they're doing this within the same structures, but they obviously have a team to navigate that. And so they have the resources to do it and to make it happen. Otherwise, I'll pass it to Mike to say if he has any other suggestions there.
Well, yeah, thank you, Katrina, and everyone. I would just say the research that we're doing is to address some of those areas. We are looking at, where are the right places for microgrids, and there, so that there is an opportunity. There are challenges that we can work through the PUC, through the IOUs, and through the legislature. SB 1339 was a big step in the right direction, and we're still working through that. So I would have to say, California is probably the most aggressive in doing these types of microgrids. There's also more restrictions, I think, in California than other states. So I guess the answer to your question is we are working these actively. We are doing this from a perspective of trying to figure out the value microgrids provide and where is the most appropriate place to put those. To date, the Energy Commission has invested in about 55 to 58 microgrids in different demonstrations over the last decade, and a considerable number under EPIC, about 45 under EPIC. So we do have a considerable database we're working with. And so I think the answer to your question is what we're trying to do is provide the data and facts that allows the PUC, the IOUs, and the legislature to make some of those decisions.
Thank you very much, Mike and Katrina. That's wonderful. I have an open question from Bob Kibrick, and I have to confess I'm a big EV geek, and so I felt the need to kind of bring this into the conversation. Bob wants to know, electricity stored in EV batteries represents a huge amount of potential energy storage in this regard. So I'm just curious, how do you guys see, he mentions CHAdeMO is on its way out and CCS is coming in, doesn't have two-way charging. There's a lot of technical aspects here, but Mike, perhaps you want to address this first from the perspective of the Energy Commission. How might vehicle to grid technologies play into this, and how soon can we expect to see that here in California?
Well, we have a long history of doing vehicle to grid. I was involved in the largest one at LA Air Force Base, and we are continuing to do those microgrids. Several of our microgrids are using V2G. It's mostly for demonstration purposes. The amount of energy isn't that substantial right now. Obviously, as we transition to the goal of all of our vehicles eventually being electric vehicles, this opportunity needs to be addressed. So I would say that, one of the challenges we run into is when you're doing V2G, is the communicating with the ISO, communicating with the utility, and the cost to export your energy as opposed to doing smart charging, for example, where you're basically doing demand response and you're charging at times when the rate is the best, and also you're not charging at times the grids are a challenge. So we're finding that demand response, smart charging, and vehicle to building right now are not as complicated, and we're doing more work in that area. And of course, once you work out the vehicle to building technology, then you can pretty simply change it to vehicle to grid. But there are some, challenges when you do this on the grid safety, on what the ISO needs and projections. So I would say we are continuing to do and will continue to do additional research in that area. I would agree that if we're going to have eventually have all the California vehicles electric, it seems like a waste to just have them charge and not participate in the grid. So we are continuing, but it is not what I tell most of our research projects. If you're going to do a microgrid with V2G and you're going to do demand response and customer side of the meter, you can expect maybe 4 to 6 months for your interconnection. If you're going to do V2G, don't be surprised if it's 1 to 2 years to get your interconnection worked out and all the details. So it's just right today, there's a lot of uncertainty. We are certainly doing a lot of work in that area, and we see the opportunity. It's just not progressing as fast as other areas.
All right. Well, thank you for that perspective and highlighting some of the challenges there.
I'll just add one opportunity if we can. We have an investment plan. Our interim investment plan is going to be focusing on vehicle to building in the next round. So if you're interested in that, I'd follow the next solicitations. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. We have time for one more question. I'd like to direct this one to you, Ami. To play devil's advocate, it was asked, local solutions create gentrification, pushing lower income folks out of that local spot. So do the solutions need to be more systemic and spread out to prevent this issue? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I appreciated this question, was attempting to answer in the chat, but I do think it's something worth really uplifting, as there are unintended consequences to these projects if we're not really intentional about how we approach these technologies. So I really want to emphasize this for this group, like the how, the process is so incredibly important. And in addition to community leadership, anti-displacement, protections, measure affordability protections are really critical. I think if folks, two resources I would offer in the bill we're working on, AB 1087, as well as a bill we passed a couple years ago, AB 1232, we really wanted to highlight this nexus between clean energy investments and displacement and sort of housing implications. So where we see projects on affordable housing or where we're pushing for that, we are also including language and requirements that whether through an affordability covenant, an agreement that hopefully has some enforceability to make sure landlords don't increase rent. On community projects, it's a little bit more complicated, but I think housing is a good place to start from. And I just appreciate that, because again, the process, the how really gives us sort of signals about how to design policy to include some of these consequences.
Wonderful, thank you. And I did notice that you were answering that in the Q&A, but I thought it was critical enough that I wanted everyone to hear the answer. So thank you for addressing that. Mel, I just want to give you a chance. Is there anything you would like to add on any of these topics, vehicle to grid, issues of gentrification and community, anything you want to add from Silicon Valley's perspective before we move on?
Yeah, I can, on vehicle to grid, I do want to mention that there is a CCA working group that is addressing these issues. So FCC is involved in that, and that is something we're exploring. On the piece of gentrification, I think that's an incredibly important piece as well. So FCC in our strategic plan has prioritized a focus on equity and affordability in terms of how we approach policies as well. And so it's in how we assess, we do assessments of our customer base, and we're doing that through a lens of socioeconomic and vulnerability indices in addition to other metrics as well. And we are looking at developing an equity framework in terms of ensuring that our program offerings are reaching all communities, all customers, vulnerable and less vulnerable alike. And then the last piece I just want to mention, based on what the last speaker said, was I did want to mention that we're also looking at, we have bill protections in place, and we're also looking at that and evolving that. So it is a big picture and a sort of a comprehensive picture when you're looking at equity, and it's something that we are looking at in developing best practices. So yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing the CCA perspective here and Silicon Valley Clean Energy in particular. Lorenzo, you started this whole conversation going with some framing. We'd only have about 1 minute or less left, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to make any concluding comment that you feel would be appropriate to put a bow on it, so to speak.
Sure, thanks, Doron. I've been looking through a lot of the comments coming in the Q&A about how do we do this or how do we do that, much of which has to do with the institutional structure of the utilities and the Public Utilities Commission and the rules that are in place. Really, it's at an institutional level that most of our barriers exist. And to me, I think the essential strategy is that more of us need to learn how to work collaboratively, create broader coalitions, bring people together to work on specific problems. And every time we form a coalition and we advocate something with many, many voices, advocating the same thing or advocating a common proposal, every little victory is really important because we're learning a different way of doing things other than just relying on what's decided at the political level to trickle down. So I think, to me, that's the most crucial thing we can do.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Well said. I mean, ultimately, it's about political will. It's about people. It's not just about technology and systems. It's about us getting it done. And really, frankly, I'll just take a moment and say that's what Climate Safe California is all about. It's about a multi-pronged coalition. I noticed some of you have gone in and endorsed that. I'm going to ask Nina to just drop that link in the chat one more time. And I would encourage those of you not to consider endorsing Climate Safe California. There it is. So we've heard from government folks, we've heard from community. It's time to hear from industry. Industry perspective. What's this really going to take from a private sector perspective? We have some great speakers here today. And to moderate this panel and lead us through the Q&A, I'd like to welcome Jason Simon from Enphase Energy. He leads their Policy and Government Affairs Initiative. Enphase is an amazing company. We're very proud to have them here in Sonoma County. We're going to drop a little more detail in the chat, but in order that there's plenty of time for this fantastic conversation, I'd like to now turn it over to Jason to introduce and frame, then introduce our speakers and lead the Q&A. Jason, take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much, Doran and the Climate Center for a great webinar on an extremely important topic. So let's cut to the chase. This is a new dawn for advanced technologies to help solve for energy resiliency challenges due to extreme weather events. First question to our panelists today is whether or not we're seeing energy resiliency systems being broadly deployed in the areas we need them the most, which is vulnerable communities, which is what we've already discussed with our previous speakers. Massive grid outages, communities being destroyed, lives being lost. There's clearly a big urgency. And if not, then why? To our panelists, after a brief introduction, can you discuss one gating factor to mass adoption, whether it be regulatory, policy related, or structural? Try to keep it tight with answers under 2 minutes. After 20 minutes, we're going to go to Q&A. So attendees, please provide your questions in advance. Rachel, good to see you again. We'll kick it off with you. I know that Sunrun's been thinking a lot about this topic. Can you please obviously briefly provide an introduction and give us, the inside track as to what you're seeing in the field?
Sure, thanks, Jason. So hello, good morning. My name is Rachel McMahon and I'm on Sunrun's policy team. And I'm focused on grid services in the California market, and I'm very excited for this discussion. So thanks so much for the invitation. I spend all of my time in policy venues, so my remarks are very much from the perspective of the legislative and regulatory framework, most specifically the Public Utilities Commission. So really quickly, a little bit on Sunrun. So Sunrun is the nation's leading provider of residential solar and solar plus storage systems for individual customer power and resiliency. Sunrun is also aggregating solar plus storage systems into virtual power plants, which we've talked about today, to provide capacity and other grid services to enhance the reliability and resiliency of the grid. And now in this space specific to community grids and to microgrids, we have been advancing a concept we refer to as the clean, resilient neighborhood grid. So the neighborhood grid vision is consistent with the theme of this webinar, quite consistent actually, as it focuses on enabling entirely community-driven, clean, resilient local grids, wherein neighbors can share power with each other from their own solar and storage systems, most likely coupled with some amount of on-site clean generation and storage at the distribution substation to enable the community to be entirely resilient and sustainable in all conditions, including during public safety power shutoff events and also supply shortages, which affect all ratepayers. And despite the focus on emergency procurement at the Public Utilities Commission, we are not out of the woods on that, and our supply shortages are growing. So Sunrun published a concept paper early last year titled Smart Clean Neighborhood Grids, Redesigning Our Electric System to Help Communities Power Through Blackouts. We're active in the California Public Utilities Commission's microgrid proceeding on a few very specific issues that I will discuss as we get into the panel discussion on the questions that Jason mentioned. We also, within the PUC docket, participated in a workshop, and this was in August of last year, that was focused on providing total clean solutions, specifically alternatives to temporary diesel generation at select substations and PG&E service territories. So a ton of work went into it, and we found that we actually could replace, under a few different scenarios, the entirety of the Cabello substation and PG&E service territory. And thus far, that input has somewhat gone ignored by the PUC, which I'll talk about a bit. So thank you, and I look forward to this discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel. Sounds like obviously there is a big regulatory need for us to spend a lot more focus on this very issue. David, you bring a very interesting perspective, obviously, to the table. Can you obviously provide a brief introduction and give us the inside track on what you're seeing in the field and what you believe the one gating factor is that we need to address today?
Well, thank you, Jason, and good morning, everybody. Picking up where Rachel left off, in addition to the regulatory framework, Terra Verde is thinking a lot about kind of the business model and the market work that's needed to align the right stakeholders to see community resiliency deployed at scale. We've seen in the aftermath of the PSPS events here in California, a tremendous surge of demand for on-site solar and battery projects, which is great news for local customers, but it spells a real challenge for energy providers, the utilities and the CCAs. At Terra Verde, we work a lot with CCAs on thinking through program design and how to partner with their customers on these types of strategic resiliency initiatives. But there's a real misalignment currently for the, call it status quo project framework as customers are deploying distributed solar and battery systems, that spells a massive revenue loss challenge for the energy provider. I'll share just one brief slide to show you what we're talking about. In a recent study of 175 commercial customers deploying solar and battery projects in a specific territory, those customers are going to see substantial cost savings benefits. They're going to get the backup power benefits of having these resources available during these grid outages. But the problem is that though the load serving entity, the energy provider, the CCA in this case, though they can develop some type of cost savings value, either through leveraging these resources against their day ahead purchases or by reducing their resource adequacy obligations, the values that can be delivered through those procurement cost savings are minimal when compared with the revenue loss challenge. You can see here that for this one study, when these 175 customers deploy their solar plus battery projects, customers win, but the CCA loses to the tune of some $62 million of revenue loss that when compared against these cost savings values potentially delivered through those distributed energy resources results in a net loss of $42 million over the life of those projects. And so this is one of the challenges that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about, and excited to share more about our thinking on this later on in today's conversation.
All right, great. Thanks very much, David. It sounds like you're addressing a big structural challenge that we need to find resolution to. Artie, you also bring a very unique perspective to the market. Hoping you could briefly introduce yourself and provide the insider's track as to what you're seeing in the field and a gating factor that we really need to focus on as an industry.
Yes, thank you, Jason. And it's such a pleasure to be on this panel talking together with Rachel and David. It's really an honor. So I can only add a little bit more on it. I have a couple of slides to show what are our activities in the market. So just a second, I'm putting this here up. So hopefully everyone can see that. What we do is we want to share our experience to show the most biggest gating factor that we have seen in the last 2 years of our development activities. In this slide, we are showing about 506 parcels that we have identified that are eligible for fast track and are a great opportunity to create more solar plus storage projects front of the meter. And as I said, most of them are inside the service territory of the CCA or in disadvantaged communities. Out of those 506 parcels, we have identified about 20 projects that result into 70 megawatt DC solar capacity and including storage capacity of another 85 megawatt hour. And this is really the fact that's where we are getting started. We have really the interconnection status, which you see on that slide, is we have about 4 projects that could only pass the fast track, and we have a majority that failed or is still ongoing in the process. So we would wish that that process can be much more efficient. We see delays just because of applications that are not deemed complete, and we have to keep following up. But we also see that there are some unnecessary steps in that process that the utility by itself knows that most of the time will fail. So we would wish we could skip that steps. So there is lots of good things. We don't want to blame or finger point, but we will believe or hope in the future that process can be much more efficient. You also see delays on COD dates, about 24 months. And so hopefully that can be much better in the future. Would be my answer to the effects. Thanks.
Thanks, Artie. I mean, it sounds like you're identifying a huge bottleneck. Obviously, we need to figure out how to resolve it. Sticking with you on this theme of obviously interconnection, what type of resolution do you think that we could find as an industry to alleviate the bottleneck so we could, move projects like these forward, which are critically important for community resiliency?
Yeah, thank you. So let me just then continue my presentation. Basically, yes, we have on that other slide here showing that our activities are more towards the full feeder microgrid or partial feeder microgrid. So We really want to island the substation, and we believe the solar plus storage solution had the potential to do so. And the challenges that we definitely see is here we are just showing an example how a high-risk area that can be supported much with the development of lots of smaller sites. Each of them are distributed energy resources between 2 to 3 megawatt. But where community microgrid is not possible without the support of the utility. So we definitely believe new regulations are necessary, and they should really resolve the conflict of interest between load serving entities like CCAs and investor-owned utilities. We have seen something as an example, the PCIA charges, the PCIA exit fees, the kind of more hurting and not helping the relationship. And we really would wish to see in the future that there are some new policies and regulations that can help into that.
Thanks very much, Artie. I hope that, after this presentation today that, we could, reach out to policymakers and regulators and really put a specific focus on this topic, because it does seem like it's necessary for us to do so. David, you've addressed a structural issue. It sounds like you have a very unique solution to what looks to be a problem that could really open up the market. Could you discuss that for us?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And I'm putting in the chat a link to an article we recently published to further explain what I'm going to just highlight here. But in partnership with one of our CCA clients, the city of Pico Rivera's Prime CCA, as of last night, their city council approved the launch of the implementation phase of what we're calling the distributed PPA program, where a CCA partners with their customers in procuring their solar plus battery energy resiliency projects through this innovative partnership. In this program, energy providers like CCAs will target customers, get their buy-in to this program framework, and then run a joint solicitation on behalf of their customers to bring the vendor community lower cost of customer acquisition, the efficiency of developing a portfolio of projects at scale. Customers get bill savings and energy resiliency, but the CCA, because of this innovative contracting mechanism, is no longer cut out of these projects, but actually is a direct participant and a stakeholder in the projects. You can see here that the kind of financial relationships are tied both between the vendor, the CCA, and the customer, where the CCA is paying a relatively low price to the vendor for the solar plus battery resources that are deployed at customer sites. They're then charging a markup to their customers at a margin on what they're paying to the vendor, effectively passing through the value of that PPA to their customer at a markup, which then results in both the customer saving money in terms of their electricity costs, as well as the CCA earning a margin, a net revenue on those individual projects. And that totally flips the financial paradigm for the CCA for that same portfolio of projects that we looked at previously. You can see here that, again, there's that $62 million revenue loss from those 175 projects. And you still see those procurement costs and RA obligation reduction savings, but now they have the added benefit of a direct relationship to renewable energy certificates related to the solar generation, as well as the net revenues from the distributed PPA framework. So this is a version of a program framework that unlocks the value of distributed energy resources in a way that uniquely aligns the interests of vendors, CCAs, and customers. So we're extremely bullish that this will help fuel the accelerated adoption of these energy resiliency technologies at scale, because it solves one of those key critical issues of the misalignment between stakeholders.
Right. Thanks very much, David. It sounds like it's really important for people to start thinking about how to incorporate this type of structure into their business practices from an economic perspective. Rachel, you are sitting in a very unique position in the industry on the firing lines from a regulatory perspective. What do you see in your seat, in your position, as to what we really need to do to open up the market from a regulatory perspective?
Sure, thanks for the question. So 3 recommendations. So to the first issue, which others have touched on and I touched on in my opening, is that existing law and current interpretation of that law effectively prohibits non-utilities, including individual customers, from providing power to households unless under the administration of the regulated utility. So we still have a very top-down structure. And more specifically, it's the interpretation of both Public Utilities Code Section 218 and Utility Rules 18 and 19. So the first addresses which entities are defined as public utilities and thus subject to state regulation. And then, excuse me, the second effectively prohibits customers from providing power to their neighbors except under certain conditions. So microgrid proponents, including Sunrun, have proposed methods to the PUC of permitting provision of these services within the PUC's existing regulatory framework without requiring being regulated like a full utility. And the PUC has vociferously declined. So we'll continue to work on these concepts, but quite honestly, I think it might require legislation. Now, to the second issue, which is the lack of clear incentives for the utility, including primarily the lack of a firm regulatory directive to procure clean long-term solutions to community resiliency. So thus far, the directives have been short-term and do not actually force the utility to do anything other than sign short-term contracts for year-over-year diesel generation. And I'm talking specifically in the context of public safety power shutoffs. In the regulatory context, we can't talk about microgrids without also talking about PSPS. Now, ultimately, I mean, the final directives from the PUC improved in response to advocacy. So as we stand now, utilities may reserve temporary diesel generation on an annual basis, but must also show their plans to develop clean microgrid projects. And they're required to file an application in June 2021 with detailed plans. So we do get another bite at the policy apple for 2022 and beyond. And for a bit of my history, so I've been working in this space in California since Groundhog Day in 1998 and through the last energy crisis. And my remarks to the PUC were in response to their essentially, which was kind of their initial microgrid decision within the relevant track of their proceeding, which didn't really have any teeth in it to require the utilities to do anything other than adhere to their own business model and procure short-term generation. And they said, this is worse than the energy crisis. Like, we didn't do this in the energy crisis in part, but we also created programs like STRIP, which is of course funding a lot of storage today, primarily in resilient communities. Created programs in order to move ourselves off of these technologies, and now we're going back. The third issue, which is very important just in terms of, how do I say, embedding and valuing the service that is essentially invaluable, which is resiliency. Like, what is the actual value of resiliency? And on the one hand, I would say that, you know, it is something that is incalculable, but at the same time, if we can price climate change, we can price resiliency, and we can build it into our model so that we value these community-driven solutions to create local resiliency. And that is something that we've been advocating to the PUC to establish this value. They haven't yet. There's a working group process, but it really is, I think it's a mixture, honestly, of regulatory slog and legislation, and more of us coming together, because a number of parties in the docket have very similar visions, but more of us coming together to push en masse.
Thanks very much. It sounds like we need to instill some urgency in the regulatory process, and agree, we all need to work together to obviously have these critical issues rise to the top. So thanks very much to each one of our panelists. We have a little under 4 minutes. Really, the last question is the defining moment for us to communicate to policymakers and regulators. What is on our wish list for 2021? What do we need to see to really open up this market? And how is it that we could accomplish this in the very short amount of time that we have, given the issues that obviously stand before us? Rachel, let's stay with you. What is your one thing on the wish list, or two things?
I have three things. So my first thing is a clear directive to the IOUs to invest in and stop standing in the way of long-term clean resilience solutions, both at the customer and substation community level. Number two, serious productive discussion and policy development around sharing power, and third-party microgrids. So as many spoke about, and as Lorenzo highlighted so well in his opening to this webinar, is that we can't rely on this utility-centric model to move forward. It has to be community-driven. It has to be. And we need to be able to have a serious conversation about that. And number three is what I just mentioned, which is the value of resiliency. Let's act like this matters.
Absolutely, and I'll throw my hat in for obviously modifying the over-the-fence rules. It seems to be a hugely limiting factor that we need to address. Artie, what's on your wish list?
Thank you. So DC coupled energy storage can be much better incentivized. We believe volumetric payments, like a price at the US dollar per megawatt hour, would be very helpful. We're missing this most of the times. We also believe a denominator based on a total annual energy purchase is much better than just on a discharge. So it is important to understand that there is more complexity with DER system. They are smaller, so they are a little bit more expensive, especially with the microgrid system integration. We would love to see that there is some funding mechanism that allows this longer development timeline and cost. And we also would like to see that there is a more of a standardized matrix of measuring resiliency and reliability. So these are a couple of things that we are hoping to see, and I would say it is the most important message to regulators is understand that without grid resiliency, utility power shutoffs will be more frequent and will not support California through climate crises. So let's hope for the best, and we are all excited. I guess the future is promising. I would say just in general, effective solution to speed up interconnection and solve permitting roadblocks, and also see that there is a much easier access to renewable energy, especially on the community greater scale.
Great, thanks very much, Artie, and I also echo the urgency on all those issues that you mentioned. David, minute and a half, what's on your wish list?
More money. Well, specifically in the category of SCHIP funding, this program has been absolutely crucial to helping accelerate the deployment of local community resiliency projects. We work both with CCAs, but also with public agencies, such as water agencies and schools, who have desperately needed the funding and the incentives from this program to advance their projects so that we can keep schools open and we can keep critical infrastructure operating in the absence of grid power. And just a couple of quick slides to highlight where we're at with SCHIP funding. You're looking at here the latest as of yesterday of where funding availability is for base level incentives for commercial scale projects that are helping fund portions of these community resiliency projects. And you can see here that across California, depending on where these projects are located, funding is running out really swiftly. For the PG&E market, funding is expected to be all but gone within the next 6 months, maybe less. In Southern California region, we've got maybe a year left, and San Diego tailing behind that. You can see here for the richer equity resiliency incentive that covers the majority, if not all of the costs for those batteries, already fully subscribed in the San Diego and PG&E markets, with Southern California Edison to follow shortly behind. So my message, my wish list to the community is advance the message that this has been an extremely successful program that needs continued funding availability for the market to continue to drive these types of programs and projects forward.
Great, thank you very much, David, and all the panelists today. We're going to switch to our Q&A right now. Obviously, being the moderator, I have the liberty of asking the first question. David, let's stick with you on SCHIP. Obviously, we need a legislative act to increase the funding. Is there anything that we could do at the regulatory level to maybe transfer funds in between, obviously, different PA's portfolios? Is that a solution, or do we need to go straight to the legislature and increase funding for these programs?
It's probably something of a both and. I mean, there are certain funds that are going to see a slower drawdown than others, and you hate to see projects that are shovel ready sitting on wait lists when there's funding available in the program. Many of us are familiar with what occurred earlier in 2019, where $270 million worth of shovel-ready projects were waitlisted under the SCHIP equity budget, one of the various kind of sub-categories within this wider incentive program. We saw the reallocation of $100 million, and projects were advanced, but there's still projects that are sitting on that wait list ready to go. The due diligence has been done, the stakeholders are aligned. It's just we need the incentive funding. And so I think it's both, get funding to where there are projects now, but don't hamstring these other very crucial elements of the program. We need funding at the residential level. We need funding, continued funding within the equity versions of the program. It's really all up and down the every bucket of SCHIP. So both exploring reallocation efforts, but I think there's no way around finding more funding for this program.
Great, thank you very much. Questions obviously from the audience. This question's for Rachel from Nick Peterson. How do the Sunrun neighborhood substation approach work with power generators using a different vendor for solar system and storage? Rachel, could you take a stab at that?
We have a different vendor from Sunrun.
That's what the question is, yes.
Sure. And we've actually discussed this in the PUC proceeding. So we would simply partner with them. So energy companies and developers partner with each other for various reasons all of the time. And that's what we would do. So in no way is Sunrun proposing to construct front of meter generation or storage, at least not at this time, at least not as far as I'm aware of. So we would partner.
Great, thank you very much. This question is from George Beeler. I think it might be an open question. Does the demonstration CCA local solar plus storage project include solar water heating for adjacent buildings? Don't know who that question is addressed to, but whomever it is, so maybe take a stab at it.
That might have been a reference to the distributed PPA program that we were deploying. And at the current stage, we're only evaluating solar and storage as the DERs, but that's by no means the limiting factor of where that program structure could be deployed. Integrating other technologies, especially thinking about as fleets are electrifying, how you could take a kind of programmatic approach to intelligently incentivizing the right type of fleet charging operating profiles to align, again, customer in.
I think we lost your audio, David. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question from Eric Strid. This is an open question. How will green hydrogen generation within a microgrid change the optimal architectures? While the economics may be 10 years away, that's within the expected time, operating lifetime of new projects. Anybody on the panel want to take a stab at that? Possibly Artie.
Yeah, I was actually focusing on answering another question, but yeah, I'm not very sure how to answer that question, but maybe Rachel or David can jump in there.
Jason, apologies. I think my headset went dead for a moment there. What was the question?
The question is specific to green hydrogen generation within a microgrid, changing the optimal architectures. While the economics may be 10 years away, that's within the expected operating lifetime of new projects. How will green hydrogen generation within a microgrid change the optimal architectures? Is a specific question.
Boy, I'd love to say I've got a working theory on that. I think the message that's kind of neighborhood adjacent to that we certainly are spending a lot of time thinking about is how to most effectively integrate the other generation technologies that are needed, kind of pairing solar and batteries with the other types of energy resources where specifically there's space availability constraints, in certain parts of the state of California, citing the robust resources needed for meaningful resiliency is not a problem. In other places where there's high density, it's much more challenging to figure out how to cite local resources. And so I think this is one of those technology innovation questions that needs to be advanced, and certainly interested in hearing what others think about this.
Great, thank you very much. Next question is from Kevin Conway. This is an open question. What is considered a neighborhood microgrid? For example, how many houses or how large an area is a typical neighborhood microgrid? Rachel, it sounds like this is a question to the work that Sunrun's done, and obviously others on the panel as well.
Sure. And to be clear, just to clarify, this is simply a concept. So in particular, the prohibition against customers to share power has been a prohibition, or it has sort of stood in the way of us realizing this, at least thus far. So we're looking at more innovative approaches, essentially, to get a pilot project. So I think I answered this already, but in technical or more practical terms, so a neighborhood is defined as basically customers on the same distribution feeder. And so to the question of how many customers, so given that we would look, the goal is to serve the entire neighborhood or all of those customers. So as many of those customers could have on-site storage and clean generation as possible. And if not all of them, then that's where, a fuel cell or solar and storage or, standalone storage at the distribution substation would come in to make up for the difference.
Great, thanks very much. Anybody else on the panel? No, well, I think that I just got I got the hook, so I think we need to wrap up here. Doran, I believe that was you sending me the message. So turning it back to you. Thanks everybody for contributing to obviously some excellent dialogue on the panel today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Doran,
Doran,
you
I
might
think
be on
you're,
mute.
you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So I just want to say thank you to all the panelists, and thank you also to you, Jason, and Enphase for being an important part of this and for doing a great job today moderating the panel and handling, really a very complex and diverse set of issues. We've got a couple more really exciting portions for everybody here. We invite you all to please do stick around because we've got some action items for you, and then we have a really interesting wrap from my colleague, Kurt Johnson, who's going to try and put a bow on all the complicated things. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed with all this incredible information, stick around because we're going to wrap it all up for you. But again, the Climate Center and Climate Safe California is about taking action. It's about moving policy forward. As we discussed, there are barriers to achieving what we want to do. And we have two bills currently in the legislature. And I'd like to invite my colleague, Nina Turner, to hop on the call and let you all know what you can do right now to help move distributed energy resources and community energy resilience forward right here, right now. Go ahead, Nina.
Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Janina Turner. I am the Energy Program Coordinator here with the Climate Center, and I want to thank you all for participating in today's webinar. If you haven't already endorsed Climate Safe California, that's our first action. I'm going to redrop that link in the chat. So endorsing was one of the action items we had for you today, and I want to tell you about a few more. Our next action for you is to contact your legislators to support Senate Bill 99. This bill works to support community energy resilience by empowering local governments to plan to use clean, distributed energy with a focus on prioritizing California's vulnerable communities. So you can contact your local representatives on the page that I'm about to share in the chat once again. So if you click on that, you'll see that we actually have written out the letter to your assembly member and state senator. All that you have to do is fill out that information at the top and then click the Take Action button at the bottom. So I'm going to give everyone about a minute to fill that out and submit it. And additionally, if you can support SB 99 on behalf of your organization or business, if you scroll down, you'll see a secondary form. So fill that out if you want to support SB 99 on behalf of your organization or business. And again, I'll give you all a few seconds to fill that out. It's fairly simple, shouldn't take too long. And while you're doing that, I'm going to queue up our next action item. We have one more. So our next request is similar to what you are doing or have finished doing right now. So SB 99 will support communities in order to plan for community energy resilience. We're also asking individuals and organizations to support Assembly Bill 1325, which will provide funding to implement clean energy community resilience in vulnerable communities. The bill directs the California Public Utilities Commission to establish an ongoing program to enhance energy resilience for California's most vulnerable communities by developing microgrids for critical public facilities like community centers, clinics, schools, and senior centers. So I'm going to drop another link in the chat. And again, it's the same process that we just did with the SB 99 page. Just fill out your information there and click the Take Action button towards the bottom. And again, if you would like to support this on behalf of your business or organization, you can scroll down a little further. You'll see a second form and you can fill that out as well. And I'll give everyone another 30 seconds or less to fill out that form as well. And if you feel rushed, don't worry, those pages will be there. You can definitely take your time filling that out outside of this webinar. But I want to thank you all for taking action with me today. And I'm going to pass this over to Kurt Johnson, who is our Community Energy Resilience Manager, to talk about some key takeaways from today.
Thanks, Nina. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
So I'm going to try and do in a couple of minutes some of the key points I heard just rolling through the panel. Lorenzo talked about how the grid's evolving in response to technology changes. And if we sort of avoid these technological changes, and do nothing, we're going to wind up with the wealthiest are going to get affected, wealthiest organizations, individual residences and businesses, and that's going to lead sort of the rest of us with a suboptimal system. So we really need to seize the moment and create an entirely new market structure to meet our decarbonization, equity, and resilience goals. Katrina talked about the CEC program for the Advanced Energy Communities program that helps provide a vision for where we could go in the future with this kind of thing statewide. And similarly, Ami talked about the RISE project in Richmond as a great example. And that's thinking not just about energy infrastructure and resilience, but thinking in a much more sort of holistic social infrastructure resilience frame to sort of drive all this forward. And she talked about AB 1087 legislation that would systematize state support for that kind of project across the state. Mel talked about how CCAs are on the front line of figuring out how to do all this. Silicon Valley Clean Energy has dedicated staff working with local government agencies to figure this out, and they have sizable local dollars that they're handing out to their member agencies to try and figure this community energy resilience planning thing out. That's exactly what we want to see happen on a statewide basis through the passage of SB 99, which would sort of centralize that function within the CEC so we can all learn from and benefit from the experiences of all the investments that the state has made to get best practices and get lessons learned into the hands of local governments. Rachel talked about the Sunrun vision for smart, clean neighborhood grids and talked about some of the key barriers to getting there, including obviously the sort of, the 218, prohibition, providing power to neighbors. That's always an omnipresent regulatory challenge. Lack of a firm regulatory directive, that resilience that's not diesel based needs to be the focus of where the IOUs are focusing their attention. That's not currently what's happening at all. And we need to sort of value resiliency. And, she talked about how, we can start valuing climate change, and we haven't sort of advanced systematically to think really, actually the Clean Coalition's done great work in this regard, to think about how you value resiliency and start throwing numbers at these things to yield sort of more economically rational decisions. David talked about the need for new business models. There's currently a misalignment because of the revenue loss for the load serving entity. And he talked about how that could potentially be fixed through a new PPA program, and also the need for more money for SGIP, which is, as people know, that's been the big pot of money that's been funding energy storage. Well, it goes back 20 years, but in the last couple of years, it's been funding energy storage specifically, and the money is rapidly running out, notwithstanding the fact that the legislation creating that SB 700, which threw close to $1 billion to that, is supposed to go to 2024, and that's going to be gone potentially very quickly. So there's a policy need there. Already talked about the need to accelerate interconnection, PCI charge, and similarly the idea that we need to standardize how we think about reliability and resilience and make policy decisions commensurate with the more coherent policy frame. Key takeaways for me, bottom line, a couple things. State policy is currently broken. Most of the barriers are institutional and they're policy barriers. We have the technology to go where we need to go. We just need to get the policy enacted in Sacramento and before the PUC to make these things happen. And finally, most importantly, we need to collaborate in making these changes in the microgrid proceeding, as well as in Sacramento. You've heard about bills that are getting their SB 99, 1325, and AB 1087. More info on all this is on our website, theclimatecenter.org/microgrids to learn more. And back to you, Duran, for the final minute.
Thank you so much, Kurt. That was great. Thank you for putting a bow on a very complicated subject. And for those of you who don't know, Kurt is deeply involved in this stuff and knows a lot. So I want to thank everybody one more time, all of you for coming. Thank you for those of you who endorsed. I see more endorsements are coming through. Climate Safe California is exactly what we're talking about, a comprehensive policy platform that brings us all together. We need big solutions because it's a big problem, but working together, we can do it. So thank you so much for being a part of this. Remember our next webinar, April 28th, on getting to 2030, clean mobility with speed and equity. I want to thank our sponsors one more time: Renewable America, Enphase Energy, Jackson Family Wines, MCE, Willow Creek Wealth Management, Bay Area Air District, Peninsula Clean Energy, Silicon Valley Clean Energy, Sunrun, River City Bank, and Terra Verde. A lot of folks, because we're all working together. So thank you all. Once again, as Kurt mentioned, theclimatecenter.org for more information on all of our programs. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you all for everything you do every day to help us get closer to our dream of a climate safe California. Thank you all, and see you next time.